Good afternoon, Courtney.
Good to see you, Michael.
Great to join you in this beautiful day and great opportunity to talk to the industry about utility health and some of the exciting lessons we've learned through the last couple of years.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think that this is going to be such a great conversation today. I know we're giving folks a moment to jump on because it can be hard to join the moment that a webinar starts, and it's always nice to have just a little bit of a buffer between when the webinar starts and when we dive into the bulk of the content. But just for a little bit of background, as folks are joining, we're really excited to be here with you today. I'm Courtney Galster, the Chief Marketing Officer for Utility Health, joined here by Michael Lunzer, the founder and president of Utility Health. And this is actually a session that we are bringing back by popular demand. We originally hosted a very similar session with Weedy last month and had so much feedback that there were so many more people that weren't able to join live who wanted to have this conversation with us live that Michael reworked the presentation for some new content and some content from that session as well, so that we can dive into some of those payer case studies and implementation decisions that are driving really effective and successful implementations as plans are implementing prior auth automation. So we're really excited to dive in. If you have questions, we absolutely want to incorporate those into today's session. So drop them into the Q&A. We probably will not add them until the end of the session, just because I know Michael has a lot to cover and he may answer some of those questions as we go, but drop them in as you have them so that you don't forget what question you were going to ask, and also so that we can answer all of those at the end. Some of our team is active in the chat, but if you have questions that you want Michael to answer, just make sure that those go into the Q&A section, which is at the bottom of your screen. Michael, I am going to hand it over to you to take us away.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. One point of clarification, this actually was a presentation that was presented at AHIP a number of
Oh, I'm
years ago.
sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. That was a much smaller audience than our normal presentation, so we thought this was really a good one to bring back by popular demand because there was some great feedback from this presentation. So we've updated some of the elements as well because, as you all know, everything is moving so fast. There's a lot of change and movement in this marketplace, and all of our customers continue to progress in the things they're doing and the activities that they've taken on. So just to refresh, today we're going to talk about prior authorization compliance, specifically for CMS 0057 and the prior authorization application programming interfaces. We're going to present 3 payer case studies. But before we get into those case studies, we're going to talk about some of the key implementation decisions that were critical as these different organizations looked at this challenge and made decisions based upon their budget, their available time, and resources. So just a very brief one message here about Utility Health. We are a prior authorization solution company. Our solutions are designed for and by health plans. Ultimately, we bring significant benefit to members and providers through efficient, effective systems. We were started inside of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota in 2018. Some of the key foundational elements that we started with that continue to be a core element of Utility is that we spend a lot of time with our software as a service SaaS products, assisting health plans in codifying and maintaining their rules for prior authorizations and their medical policies. So those are 2 key things that our products do. In that experience, we've been around again since 2018. So many of these solutions have been in place with health plans for a number of years, and we've also digitized policies for multiple health plans. So to kick off the key content here, the points we're going to talk about are 4 key implementation decisions that health plans need to look at as they dive into this prior authorization initiative for 0057. And then we'll go into 3 specific case studies, their implementation scope, their strategies around medical policies and questionnaires and digitization, and some of the questions, the lessons they've learned through that process. the three health plan profiles that we'll be talking about. We have a regional health plan with 2.5 million members that addresses Medicare, commercial, and marketplace solutions. Another regional plan that's a little smaller, addressing Medicare, commercial, and marketplace requirements. And then a state-based Medicaid health plan with about 50,000 members. So a little something for everybody as we look at the different strategies that organizations pursued in this area. So as we dive into the decisions, we just want to talk briefly about what is the goal of CMS 0057? What are we trying to accomplish? And then in terms of compliance, what is the health plan requirement in this category? So first of all, there are many opportunities within compliance that could be more advanced. So there is kind of a minimum requirement to be compliant and meet CMS's requirement. But this specification for 0057 leaves a lot of opportunity for advanced capabilities and still be standards compliant. And so we'll talk about what some of those opportunities are, and we'll talk specifically around the benefits for those minimum compliance versus advanced features, and how those are affected by the availability of payer resources and the amount of time you have to accomplish the task. Very briefly, just a refresher on what the prior authorization APIs are. The first of those API requirements is coverage requirements discovery. Essentially what that means is that a provider inside of their electronic medical record system can enter an order, and once an order is entered, there's a mechanism for the EMR to automatically send over a coverage requirements discovery request, which includes enough information that when the payer receives it, they should be able to send back an answer, yes or no, prior authorization is needed. In order to perform that function, the payer needs some source of truth for those prior authorization rules. There's much more infrastructure in between these two endpoints, but today we're going to really focus on the sources of truth and some of the ways that those data elements can be configured. So again, provider writes an order, prior auth source of truth provides an answer to that question, yes or no, prior auth is needed, maybe it is a covered benefit or not. Then the provider can say, I want to submit a prior authorization, in which case the next transaction kicks in with a documents, templates, and rules, or DTR transaction that asks the payer, hey, can you send me the questionnaire that's required to be filled out in order to submit a prior authorization for this particular procedure? In order to send over that questionnaire, the payer needs some system that has the ability to know by procedure code and line of business and particular group, which questionnaire should I send over? A questionnaire, by the way, doesn't have to be a source of 15 very detailed questions. In this particular context, questionnaire can be as simple as a formatted document that says, send over the attachments that you as a provider would normally want to submit for this particular prior auth request. The questionnaire can include 15 or 20 questions, very specifically around what's the patient's BMI, how old are they, other very detailed clinical questions. So that's one of those areas we'll talk about in a minute. Once the provider's system or the provider has filled out that questionnaire, they are then prompted to submit that prior authorization, and that is using the PAS transaction, which is the bottom transaction in this list. And then when it's received by the payer, they need some method that they've determined they're going to use to make decisions. This can be as simple as the payer presenting that information to the clinical reviewer who sees that the answers to the questions next side by side with the medical records that have been submitted and the medical policy, and the payer can manually make those decisions. but there's also a lot of capabilities now that we have more structured documents to automate those decisions. One of the things I did want to talk about is why are we embarking on 0057 in the first place? And really, the core of the driving initiative is that providers feel a huge amount of friction and necessary work that creates a bottleneck for them. They have to log into many different provider portals. They have to send faxes. They struggle to know what the rules are. They have difficulty finding some of the data. And then when it comes time to actually know whether a prior authorization has been approved or not, they have to go find that often in the payer's provider portal or wait for a phone call or a letter. So CMS 0057 is really intended to help solve these problems by giving the provider the ability to perform all of their process inside the EMR. That process becomes very structured, as we talked about with the 3 transactions. So there's a standardized process. That process generates very clear rules for the provider. Does it require a prior auth? If so, what are the data elements that need to be submitted? By knowing that information, the provider has a lot more clarity and can much more easily process these prior authorizations without difficulty. The CMS 0057 process actually has a mechanism that allows for that questionnaire to be received and for the EMR to automatically answer those questions and attach documents. We'll talk a little bit more about that function in a bit. And then, of course, all of the notifications around the answer to, is this been approved or not, can also be received inside the EHR. So if you think about it at its very basic level, providers are gaining tremendous value from not having to go chase down different sources of systems, having a consistent process, and knowing what to submit. On the payer side, a lot of people think of this as a payer mandate. Ultimately, what many payers have found is this is a significant payer benefit. Now payers will be able to very clearly answer the question of, is prior auth required? By doing so, they're eliminating a tremendous amount of telephone calls that providers perform today that cause a lot of overhead on the payer. They also, by giving a clear answer to the provider of whether or not prior auth is needed, providers don't feel the need to submit prior auths for as many things. In many cases, providers submit prior auths for things they're not really sure if they require prior auth, but they just want to make sure they're going to get paid. So we're helping the provider reduce that overhead for the payer by eliminating faxes. This particular prior auth standard will dramatically reduce faxes that payers receive. And of course, faxes come in a graphical image format. In order to use them, they need to be optical character recognition performed. There's lots of heavy process or manually interacted with. All of that can go away for the payer by effectively implementing this standard. Data arrives now in a text readable format. That allows for the implementation of a lot more technology and automation. Providers are now prompted to submit the necessary information and data for a prior auth submission. There's some great statistics that show that about 70% of prior auths that are appealed and ultimately overturned, the primary driver for that is the lack of appropriate data submitted with the prior auth submission. So by helping the provider submit the right data, we can avoid those peer-to-peer calls, the unnecessary rejections and appeals. That efficiency is a dramatic improvement for the payer in this process. And lastly, by having detailed questionnaires, a payer can essentially automate a lot of prior auth decisions if the provider attests to the specific answers to those questionnaires in a very simple rules-based automation. Those prior auths can be automatically approved. So that's the summary of benefits or key elements for each side of the equation here. And what's critical is this is a rare opportunity for a new implementation to bring benefit to both stakeholders in this market. And that's why CMS 00757 has a lot of momentum behind it. It started out as a mandate, but payers are starting to realize there's significant benefit here, and providers are just starting to see and learn what's coming. And when they do learn what's coming, providers tend to be really excited about the ability to eliminate faxes and get rid of provider portals and standardize their work inside the electronic medical record system. So one of the challenges with this is, as we've covered, there's a lot of detail in these benefits and opportunities. As payers embark on this process, there's the potential that this could overwhelm them if there's too many things to accomplish. Well, the exciting thing about 0057 is that there are some decisions that health plans can make to become compliant and set the stage for incremental improvement and incremental automation. Rather than having to build the most thorough and complex system, the payer can embark on a process that accomplishes some of the tasks that we've covered and benefits, but doesn't have to be full and thorough to accomplish all of those benefits in day one. So some of the decisions that are key here are outlined on this slide, but I'm going to dive into each one specifically as we go. So the first key implementation decision for the payer is, what is the source of truth for is authorization required? When a provider calls the call center at a payer, oftentimes the call center has to review a spreadsheet and sometimes log into 2 or 3 other systems to find an accurate answer to is authorization required before they tell the provider the answer. Sometimes they actually need to talk to their peer in the call center. So now when we're dealing with a much more structured process where this is authorization required opportunity adds tremendous value and savings to the equation, payers are given the opportunity to decide, do I want to continue to work under a spreadsheet type of process where I have to manually update a spreadsheet each month, add new rules, and oftentimes the spreadsheet is not very comprehensive in its answers to the questions. In other words, the spreadsheet might answer the question, is auth required for this particular procedure code for this product of the health plan, but maybe not down to the group level. Or maybe it doesn't give a lot more specificity around that answer. And of course, if a spreadsheet is used, it oftentimes is a new spreadsheet for each month or each period of time or each new change. The alternative is to implement a prior auth rules system that allows for a more robust mechanism to identify and configure those rules and then schedule changes to procedure codes and rules over time. This allows the health plan to have a more robust system that a provider could go to on the web, for instance, and ask the question, is prior auth required for this member, this date of service, for this procedure code, and get an accurate answer versus having to review a spreadsheet. Similarly, of course, in the CRD transaction, this system is what is answering that question of is authorization required. The next level of detail on CRD response, which is a key decision for the health plan in implementing prior auth 0057, is what level of detail is the health plan going to provide? The 0057 specification includes a few additional elements that are optional. For instance, part of the CRD response can be eligibility. Is this member eligible for this health plan? Another optional element in that initial phase of implementation is a benefit-related decision. Is this a covered benefit for this member, for this plan, for this provider? Even down to, is prior auth required for in-network providers or not? So this is an area where there is the ability to not go all the way into the most complex implementation of these solutions, and perhaps allow that eligibility question to be answered in advance of the CRD transaction and not cover that eligibility response inside of the CRD. And that is a decision, again, that the health plan can make based upon their budget. In the event that the health plan has a existing system in place for benefits determination using an EDI specification or a proprietary API, those provider network rules and other benefit rules can be integrated into the CRD response. This is an area, again, where the health plan can kind of implement a minimum compliant system and mature into these eligibility and more detailed benefit related elements over time. Another key implementation decision, and this is one many health plans wrestle with, is what level of questionnaires do we include inside of the questionnaire process in that medical policy FHIR questionnaire. Again, this is the document, which is a file format that gets sent back to the provider's system in this FHIR questionnaire format that allows the provider system to open up that questionnaire and then fill out the information necessary to answer that questionnaire. The questionnaire can be really complex with many, many questions, or it can be a generic questionnaire. Some health plans implement in a scenario where maybe they have 600 policies, and each of those policies have a very detailed questionnaire that if the provider answers all of those questions and submits all the necessary information, that questionnaire is built to allow for that to be an automated approval. Other health plans are implementing maybe 20 high-level policies that cover categories, DME, for instance. And in those categories, there can be a group of questions relevant to DME, but not necessarily configured in a way that if they answer those questions, it's an automated decision. But it can also include the request for attached documents that, along with the DME-based questions and the attached documents, allows a human or an AI tool to make a decision. The key element there is, again, the health plan needs to determine a strategy around those questionnaires that fits their budget, their desires for automation, and then based upon the system that they implement, hopefully gives them the ability to incrementally improve those processes and systems. Again, that key question then is that DTR FHIR questionnaire really specific to the policy and detailed questions, or is it a more generic questionnaire that's requiring attached documents that might now require a little more manual or AI-based decisioning? And that's a great segue into the last topic for implementation decisions. And that is, what is the role of AI and how do we implement decision automation in this process? Some organizations have said, we're going to essentially delegate all of our decisioning to AI. And that AI tool is going to look at the medical policy and essentially issue an answer that, based on the probability of this member meeting the requirement, we think, AI thinks, this prior authorization should be approved or not. In some cases, that probability of decision approval can be extremely high with AI. But keep in mind, it may still be a mistake, right? AI is not perfect. We've all seen the wonderful images in the marketplace with 6 fingers on a person's photo, or a legal brief that's been submitted using AI that was incorrect. So using AI in the appropriate level at the appropriate stage is really valuable, but it's also an opportunity that comes along with this new CMS 0057 scenario, where if the questionnaire is highly detailed and the provider answers all those questions, the payer can automate the decision in this portion of the process using rules-based deterministic decisions. AI can still help in that scenario, but the benefit of deterministic decisions using the questionnaire is that your decisions can be much more accurate and faster. Even in that scenario, we know providers will still submit prior auths in which they haven't answered all the questions. And in those cases, using AI to help compare the questionnaire to the medical record and assist the internal staff of the health plan in seeing where does AI think this patient meets those requirements, and allowing those staff to then agree with AI or perhaps even augment the answers of AI to giving a very accurate review of a medical record. That is a huge opportunity as well. So again, those are 4 key decisions that need to be thought through. And next up, I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to Itility Health's products, because as we go into each of these case studies, I will refer to the Itility Health product that was used to solve the problem. So again, Itility Health, the products are on the left side of this illustration. PA Checkpoint is the Itility Health tool that helps the health plan manage and share their rules for is authorization required. The product, because we're able to answer that question accurately, has been proven to avoid 30% of prior auths, because when a provider can quickly get that answer, they don't submit prior auths for things that don't need them. Next up is policy management. The policy management system from Itility Health is where the health plan can use a tool to build and maintain their policies. And in the process of building and maintaining policies, the FHIR questionnaire is an additional element that shows up within that system. And that is then linked to the procedure codes and is the system that drives the response to send me the questionnaire that applies to this particular transaction. The next system in the Itility Health platform is prior authorization routing. This is a tool within the platform that allows us to know, for instance, if you've got a delegated vendor for a particular procedure, or that you use a third-party clinical evidence tool like a MCG or an interqual. So this tool allows us to route to a Evacor or a Lucet or a Carelon, and or to route to an MCG or an interqual or another third-party clinical system. So it also then, of course, knows when a prior auth medical policy comes from the Itility Health Policy Management tool. All of these systems are able to be configured through a user interface in a SaaS-based environment. Next up is the auto authorization system, and this allows for the automatic decisioning based upon the answers in the questionnaire, or automated decisions based upon procedure code, diagnosis code, place of service, provider ID, etc. So when you think about using the policy questionnaire, routing to the right vendor, getting all the right data, and getting providers to answer questions, that process allows for a very large percent of prior authorizations to be automated. And so now if we've got accurate information, we've got good answers to questions, and we automate 85% of prior auths through that workflow, that allows those last 15% of prior auths that haven't been fully determined based upon the deterministic questionnaire to be passed over to an AI-based tool. And this is where Itility Health has Clinical Assistant AI, which essentially puts the medical policy side by side with the medical record and allows somebody to make a decision. Just a couple quick slides on those particular products. Again, PA Checkpoint is a SaaS-based tool for managing and sharing those prior auth rules even through the website, the provider portal, or in the CRD capability. Policy management is a tool that unifies the creation, management of policies and versions, along with the metadata for which procedure codes they apply to, which lines of business. All of that is in one system that similarly produces the human readable policy for the public website of the health plan and the fire questionnaire that can be used in that deterministic process for fire. Lastly, Utility Health has Clinical Assistant AI, which is a tool that puts the questionnaire on the left side of the screen and the medical record on the right side of the screen. And as you see, if AI, for instance, is able to look at the medical record and determine that the BMI is identified in the medical record, we can highlight that and automate the answer. And this is the system that's used to help provide a very clear indication for the provider, for the payer, clinical reviewer that can go back through and document, associate data to the answers to the questions, and automate the process of making decisions. Last two slides on product before we dive into the case studies. The Utility Health applications, as I mentioned, can be used to power websites, provider portals, and can be used by the internal staff of the health plan to make decisions. And these products have been in place for many years and can now also be used for Fire API work, which ultimately then uses the same resources for Fire that are also used for the medical, the provider portal and the public website. Last slide before we dive into the use cases. This helps understand where do these systems fit in. So on the left side of this diagram, you've got the provider inside of their electronic medical record system, or using an electronic medical record system combined with a system that helps them access the prior authorization workflows. That system is then connected via Fire and some form of network to the payer. This network can be thought of similar to the telephone network. It's a method by which the provider's system can send over those CRD, DTR, and pass transactions to the payer. The provider can subscribe to a Fire network from Epic. The payer can subscribe to a Fire network from Oracle or Availity or a number of other Fire network companies. And those two Fire networks can interconnect so that the provider can easily talk to the payer. Next up is the sources of truth for the CRD, DTR, and pass. Oftentimes you'll find that the Fire servers advertise that they support CRD, DTR, and pass, which they do. They also require a source of truth for CRD, DTR, and pass. So oftentimes that source of truth for is authorization required can be PA Checkpoint, the Utility Health system that can respond to that CRD transaction that starts at the provider and goes all the way through the Fire server as a CRD endpoint and ultimately lands in PA Checkpoint. Similarly, Utility Health's medical policy system is a DTR response, a DTR source of truth that responds to the DTR request from the Fire server. Other scenarios are available where the Fire server could directly connect to another source of DTR policies. An MCG or an interqual, for example, can be the sole DTR source. Many companies have their own custom policies and a mix of delegated vendors, an MCG interqual, an Evacor, Lucid, etc. Those environments need some source that's going to delegate and manage those transactions. And that's another role that the Utility Health medical policy system plays is those things are configurable from a menu, from an easy user interface that can essentially be that orchestrator. These two systems really form the foundation of a prior auth intelligence ecosystem, or prior auth intelligence operating system. And that's really the key to ensuring that your sources of truth and your navigation is managed effectively. Once those things happen, when the prior authorization is submitted, they get delivered to the right destinations and recorded in the utilization management system, because again, those rules and knowledge are recorded in that prior auth intelligence operating system. So now we're going to dive into some specific implementations at customers and how they made those decisions around what are we trying to accomplish from a provider benefit and a payer benefit system. What's our budget? How much time do we have to implement this? And where can we implement all of it? Or where should we maybe make sure we're compliant, but leave room for expansion over time? This first use case that I'm going to talk through is an organization that started early. They had multiple years to implement these capabilities. They implemented some of the utility health systems in advance of using them for CRD, and were able to use them in the public website, for instance. So that allowed them to configure all the rules in the system to start with, and actually go through a couple phases of maturing the benefits system, for instance, to be able to query a back-end application at the health plan for network and benefit coverage information, in addition to the utility health is auth required rules. Again, those is authorization required rules were configured in PA Checkpoint, and that allows those decisions by group, procedure code, diagnosis, site of service, provider tier. Does it require prior authorization or not? Again, because they implemented the API to their back-end rule system and had time to get very detailed in these answers. Next up, they implemented the policy system with very detailed policy questionnaires. They have over 600 policies that are fully digitized and can be accessed, again, through the public website within the health plan, or again, through the CRD DTR process. This health plan implemented auto approval even within the CRD transaction. So that's an element that a lot of organizations aren't familiar with, that when a CRD is submitted, it includes information about provider, site of service, procedure code, diagnosis code, and other elements. Sometimes that information within the structured CRD response is enough to justify an approval. In this particular customer, they had the time to implement a pass process within the CRD. In the event the provider's submitted data is thorough enough to justify an approval, it actually completes the pass process without going through the DTR. Again, that's a maturity element that is definitely not required within compliance, but it's an area that the health plan can pursue to add even more ease of use for them and the provider. Next up, this health plan implemented delegated vendors and sub-policy vendors as DTR sources and PAS destinations. So again, Utility Health has the majority of their medical policies with detailed DTR questionnaires, but there are delegated vendors in their environment that have their own DTR questionnaires, and they subscribe to policy criteria, clinical criteria from a third party. And that data is then obtained throughout this ecosystem. Again, as I mentioned, this client implemented their web-based tools to be able to do a prior auth lookup, as well as allow a provider to look for specific policies and details at a very granular level. And then lastly, this client wanted to use this new architecture for all of these rules, CRD, DTR, pass, which now are their single source of truth. They wanted to use that as a mechanism to interact with their provider portal. So in the event a particular provider doesn't have their CRD, DTR, pass capabilities inside their electronic medical record system, this payer wanted to ensure that those providers coming through their portal were using the same systems. So now the health plan doesn't need to implement different systems for CMS 0057 and their provider portal. They can use a single source of truth. So this is what that looked like in first phase. This client actually went live on this back in September of 2025. So in that scenario, inside of their provider portal, their systems were using the CRD to check the Utility Health PA checkpoint database. Is Auth required? Once is Auth required was completed, it sent over the FHIR questionnaire or questionnaires. There can be more than one based upon a procedure code for that provider to answer the necessary questions that can then drive automated determination. So this health plan, again, implemented all of these capabilities well in advance of the compliance requirement and was able to leverage them in their provider portal. Now, this payer is also able to deliver a even richer implementation inside of the full FHIR capabilities with that same provider portal system now leveraging all of the richness of the payer side of this architecture. Again, this slide shows the provider on the left side, a FHIR network for accessing the payer, and now it shows PA checkpoint as the source of truth for is authorization required, and even some limited authorization automation. Then the response to the DTR questionnaire either comes through Utility Health's medical policy system, which holds many of their FHIR questionnaires. Utility Health's medical policy system can delegate that DTR to a delegated vendor, multiple delegated vendors, or a third-party policy vendor. Those FHIR questionnaires are sent back to the provider. When they submit those FHIR questionnaires, the Utility Health Pass system can automate the answers based upon the answers in those questionnaires. It can route all of those transactions back to the utilization management system, and in some cases, the past transactions can be delegated back to the delegated or third-party tools. The exciting thing about FHIR is it delivers an architecture that allows for this scale and multi-vendor environment without the typical complexities of a multi-vendor scenario, because we're all talking using the same standards. And for that reason, Utility Health has worked with many of the delegated vendors and third-party policy vendors to certify our compliance and our interoperability with their systems. So, to get back to this case study, what did they achieve in their implementation? Ultimately, again, because they had a lot of time, they have fully implemented the ability to support the provider if they want to use their EMR. They're fully supporting the standard and structured process. They're providing very clear rules and data requirements because they've gone to very detailed questionnaires. They haven't yet pursued automatic gathering of data. Now, that's a wrinkle that I wanted to talk just briefly about. FHIR questionnaires and the standard allow for detailed codes to be assigned to those questionnaires that when received by the EHR can automatically fill out the questionnaire. The challenge in current, where we are in the implementation and evolution of this standard is there are not EHRs that fully support this capability yet. So because there is some effort in building these coded answers, Utility Health has, with the customer, we've delayed the implementation of that capability to a future phase when it's most appropriate. Providers in this scenario are also now implementing AI tools that can automate the answering of those questions without coded answers. So I think there's still a little bit of room for the market to evolve in this category. Again, a good reason why this might not be an element that the health plan spends a lot of time on to start. Lastly, of course, in this new FHIR world, the provider does get automatic notification inside the EHR of approval or not. On the payer side, we have the call centers getting the provider getting immediate answers. So the payer's call center doesn't get those calls. The provider gets really good information about what requires prior authorization, so they don't send those unnecessary prior auths. They're using FHIR, so we don't get faxes anymore. Data arrives in a text-readable format. Providers can submit the necessary data. They know what to submit, and now rules-based automation is enabled. So this is the most thorough implementation of CMS 0057 that's available today and actually in use. Next up, we're going to talk about a case study for another client that had a little less time and resources to accomplish the task. So,
Hey, Michael, we are
yes.
getting quite a few questions. Would you like me to hold all of these until the end, or would you like to answer a few of them as we're going because they might relate to what you were just sharing?
Yeah, actually, I'd like to hold them because I've just got a few more minutes to cover all the points. And then hopefully we've covered most of them and can jump back to those questions.
Sounds great.
Okay, client number 2. This payer was looking to implement this capability, but they didn't have the ability to configure those rules at a very detailed level, group level configuration, for instance, at this stage. The PA checkpoint tool they use allows them to do that, but for the first phase of their implementation, they configured rules down to a business or health plan offering level and procedure code. They utilize the ability to include messages in the CRD response relevant to is auth required or other benefit messages, rather than building an API to any back-end benefits-based system. In fact, this particular health plan didn't have a benefits rules system. They basically look at each contract to determine those benefits. So we didn't want to go deep into the benefit determination. This health plan implemented 20 custom policies with the associated questionnaires. As I talked about before, that allows for instance, a DME policy with a certain level of required files or data to be submitted without the detailed questions about each of the detailed DME specific procedures or requirements. They did implement a third-party vendor for policies and questionnaires. They implemented automatic approval within the PAS process for those custom policies in the event they had enough information to approve a procedure. They then also implemented human review of third-party questionnaires. This health plan did not implement an AI-based tool to automate the process for their reviewers. That's in the plans for additional phases. They did implement these tools for web-based rules lookup and policy details. And they then implemented the utility health tools that allow their provider portal to perform that CRD DTR pass function. What that looks like in practice is, as you see here, we only have one third-party vendor, no delegated vendors, and utility health, again, as that primary DTR orchestrator in this process. The goals for this client and what they achieved, they were able to achieve quite a few benefits for the provider. On the payer side, there's a few things that they were partially engaged with. So for instance, because they're still requiring some additional edge cases to be communicated via instructions in the CRD response, they may still get some unnecessary prior auth submissions. And then lastly, some rules-based automation is enabled, but they can add additional policies and additional detailed questionnaires over time that will automate those low-hanging fruit policies and questionnaires in the future. The last case study is a smaller state-based Medicaid plan. In this case, they had a lot less resources to use in this implementation. And so there's a few more considerations that they made to keep things simple, but achieve compliance. They implemented the PA checkpoint product at a business or plan offering level for each procedure code. They have messages within the CRD response to manage those exceptions, PA not required for in-network providers, or things like this procedure is experimental and not typically a covered benefit. Those types of messages show up. And then on the policy side, they did create 100 custom policies based on the state's provider manual. Within those custom policies, they created 20 detailed questionnaires and 80 simple or default questionnaires that just ask for attached documents and a few other questions. With those detailed questionnaires, they are able to achieve automation for those detailed questionnaires that are answered. Humans are going to review those submissions with simple questionnaires. They did, again, implement the utility health tools for web-based lookup for is auth required and policy details, and again, are implementing the utility health CRD DTR pass provider portal tool. So their implementation looks similar to the last implementation. I guess I have a mistake on this slide in that I unshared, didn't I? Sorry. I have an error here on this slide. Third-party vendor was not a part of this particular provider payer's environment. So again, this is that particular smaller payer's environment. This is the outcome that they had. In some cases, with more generic questionnaires and a little less detail in their PA checkpoint, there are some cases where the rules and data requirements are not as clear, and the provider will be required to submit data and hopefully know what those expectations are. They still will eliminate some unrequired prior auth, but there's a little room for additional detail in that answer. Providers may still be required to submit necessary data or be prompted to submit specific data, but also have to know a little bit more about what to submit. And therefore, they'll have a little less automation in this process. So just to recap on lessons learned. Ultimately, what we're trying to communicate here is that depending on the amount of money, amount of resources, amount of time that a health plan has, they can implement these tools in phases. The more foundational tools they put in place, the more that allows for maturity of their process to evolve rather than having to implement new products over time. Again, an upfront investment in detailed questionnaires can reduce staff load in the decisioning process. A mix of detailed questionnaires and simple questionnaires can allow for kind of a right sizing of the amount of effort and the value the health plan gets. What I mean by that is if the most frequently used policies are those with detailed questionnaires, we can accomplish automation for those most frequently used policies and use simple questionnaires for the less frequently used. And then lastly, a question or rules-based decision automation that can be powered by these questionnaires ultimately delivers an accurate, fast, and low-cost approach to decisioning, but again can complement an AI-based approach. So I know I haven't left a tremendous amount of time for questions. but I apologize. I wanted to make sure we covered the critical information. So, Courtney, do you want to tee up questions, or would you like me to look at the questionnaire list and take those as I see them?
Well, I can start at the beginning. We have a question that asks, aren't prior auth rules and coverage rules or documentation the same since they come from the same medical policy that decides the claim submission requirements?
Yeah, again, this is where I think sometimes people perceive that the CRD response has to include all of the benefit determination, coverage determination rules. And the reality is that is not necessary, especially if the health plan is going to receive a prior auth submission and make decisions based upon those submissions at a human level. Because in their human process today, health plans receive prior auth submissions that may not be covered, and they make those decisions based upon the prior auth rules, and in some cases issue a prior auth that says this prior auth is approved. However, it's still subject to benefit and coverage rules. So while the CRD response can be highly detailed, it is not required to be that detailed. Next question.
Perfect. How does the need to route prior auth requests to one or more delegated authorities impact the workflows?
So again, the key to being able to know where a prior auth goes with a delegated vendor is to have the procedure codes associated to some system that knows certain procedure codes by line of business or by group go to that delegated vendor. So again, there's a need for a prior auth information source, intelligence source that knows prior auth goes to a particular delegated vendor based upon certain attributes. And that is part of what is critical to the Itility Health PA checkpoint, policy management, and prior auth routing system. Sometimes health plans put that information in their FHIR server, but in many cases that is very difficult to configure. So Itility Health has made that easy to configure and a easy method to know what those rules are without having to look at spreadsheets or run IT scripts.
Thank you. Next question. Medicare Advantage requires we use NCD, LCD, LCA first before health plan policies. How were those handled?
So that is a great question. Oftentimes in a manual process, the health plan has a hierarchy that says, for instance, if somebody is asking for a prior authorization for this particular line of business, the first thing to look at is the NCDs and LCDs. If there isn't one available, then we look at the medical policy of the health plan or at a third-party policy. The new world of CMS allows that decision logic that a human might need to normally make in a human-driven process to be built into the decision logic in the system. So the system knows whether or not an NCD or LCD exists, and if so, should be used, or if not, if a dedicated health plan policy should be used. So that's a wrinkle in the way people think about this process. The decision hierarchy is built into the system that knows for this procedure code, for this group, which policy and therefore NCD, internal or third party should be used.
Perfect. And we have time for one more question quickly. I know we're going just a moment over, but I want to make sure that we get Katrina's question here. Are DTR and PASS completely coded for integration and auto completion with an EMR, or are people always needed?
Yes, that's a great question. So again, as I talked about earlier, the DTR questionnaire can have codes in it assigned to each question. For instance, BMI. If the procedure question says BMI needs to be greater than 35, there is a way to enter some CQL-based code in the DTR questionnaire that when received by the electronic medical record system, it automatically answers that question. That is the vision and the future of this opportunity for prior authorization automation. The reality is today, most EMR systems are not anywhere near close to being able to leverage those coded questions. So in the event a health plan wants to put the effort and time into coding those questionnaires, they can in the iTility Health system. However, there's an effort versus a value that needs to be put into place here. And so therefore, most payers today are implementing questionnaires with the expectation that somebody at the provider organization will manually answer those questions, or that the provider will have their own AI tool for answering questions. So that's the opportunity, of course, is as this market matures, the question is, will provider AI capabilities move so fast that payers don't need to enter codes in those questions? Or is there so much of a value in these coded questions and getting the EMR to answer those questions automatically? Is there more value in that approach? And I think the market is still looking through that decision and trying to allow this to evolve from an EMR and a provider perspective. Again, it's really important to remember there are a lot of things in this overall specification that can provide tremendous value to the payer and the provider. We want to make sure that we are at a minimum accomplishing the most critical goal, which is to help providers to not have to log into provider portals and to stop sending faxes. If we accomplish just that one objective, we've made a major difference for the industry. And I hope I've shown you that there are various ways that payers can incrementally add maturity to their offering to gain even more value than that one objective, but also to put the foundation in place that allows for an evolution to the full objective of all of the benefits for payers and providers.
Michael, thank you so much for sharing today. I know we went a little bit over, so thank you to everyone who stayed live with us while we finished answering a few of those questions that were submitted. If we didn't make it to your question, we will absolutely follow up with you over email with a response from Michael. And if you have additional questions, please feel free to send those over. I know a few of you asked in the chat whether we'd be sharing this as a replay, and yes, we absolutely will be sending that out next week. And it will be available on our YouTube page and our website as well. We hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. And we will see you shortly for our next webinar, which is actually next week, which is actually the popular demand replay of our session with Weedy on AI with Michael Lunzer and Chad Frank. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.